In the Gilded Age, every wife made the same bargain. She traded her name, her money, and her legal existence for the promise of protection. The law called it coverture. Society called it marriage. And for most women, it was a cage built from gold and lined with silence. But there were women who refused the bargain entirely, women who took the lovers, the influence, and the power, but never signed the contract. They had no ring, no legal claim, no protection at all. And they became the most powerful women of their era. Because the system designed to protect wives was never about protection, it was about control. Chapter 1. The Brooklyn Girl Who Conquered an Empire. In 1874, a 20-year-old American girl married into the British aristocracy, and within 3 years, she was sleeping with the future King of England. Her name was Jennie Jerome. She was born in Brooklyn, New York in 1854, and she grew up in a world where money arrived like weather, sudden, violent, and impossible to predict. Her father was Leonard Jerome, a man Wall Street called the King. That title was earned the way most Gilded Age titles were earned, through speculation, nerve, and an appetite for risk that bordered on recklessness. At his peak, Leonard Jerome's fortune was estimated at $10 million. He built a mansion at the corner of Madison Avenue and 26th Street that made the rest of Manhattan look restrained. It had a private theater that seated 600. The ballroom had fountains that ran with champagne and cologne. The breakfast room sat 70 guests. He co-founded Jerome Park Racetrack with August Belmont Sr. and earned a second nickname along the way. They called him the father of the American turf. Leonard Jerome was not merely rich, he was theatrical about being rich. He kept racehorses in stables attached to his mansion. He entertained opera singers, politicians, and European aristocrats with the same indiscriminate enthusiasm. He lived as though money would never stop coming, which is the surest sign that it will. And it did. Leonard Jerome's money was as volatile as the man himself. He made and lost several fortunes through speculation. By the time Jennie was a teenager, the family had moved to Paris, partly for culture, partly for the education of 3 daughters, and partly because the creditors were more polite in French. Jennie was beautiful, dark hair, gray eyes that some described as violet. The Irish peer Lord de Bernon would later call her a diamond star, describing the dark beauty of the panther. She was tall and striking in a way that made men stop talking when she walked into a room. She was also, by every account, extraordinarily intelligent. She played piano at a near-professional level, she spoke fluent French, she understood politics the way a general understands terrain, and she possessed something that no finishing school could teach. She possessed instinct. She could read a room the way her father read the stock ticker, and she was almost never wrong. In 1874, she married Lord Randolph Churchill, the second son of the 7th Duke of Marlborough. The dowry her father paid was £50,000, roughly $250,000 at the time, the equivalent of about $4,300,000 today. The settlement also stipulated that Randolph provide Jennie £1,000 per year in pin money, a sum that seems generous until you consider the cost of maintaining appearances in Victorian London. It was substantial money, but it was not Vanderbilt money, not Astor money. It was not enough to buy security. It was enough to buy entry, and entry was all Jennie needed. Between 1870 and 1914, roughly 100 American heiresses married into the British and European aristocracy, bringing an estimated £25 million across the Atlantic. That is roughly $500 million in modern terms, flowing from New York and Chicago and Boston into the crumbling estates of the English peerage. The press called them dollar princesses. The arrangement was simple and brutal. American money bought British titles. British titles bought American respectability. The bride's fathers got coronets for their grandchildren. The groom's families got new roofs for their country houses. The brides themselves got drawing rooms and silence and the privilege of being called Lady Something, while their husbands spent the dowry money on horses and other women. The brides were, in the most literal sense, purchased. Jennie was part of the first wave, but she was never just a dollar princess. She did not trade her money for a title and then sit quietly in a country house, arranging flowers and pretending not to notice her husband's absences. She traded her money for access, and then she turned that access into something far more dangerous than any title. she turned it into influence. Within 3 years of her marriage, Jennie Jerome was conducting an affair with the Prince of Wales, the man who would become King Edward VII. The prince called her one of the most beautiful women he had ever met. And the most remarkable thing about that affair was not that it happened, it was that everyone knew and everyone approved, because the Gilded Age had rules about mistresses, strict rules, ancient rules, rules that the aristocracy followed with the same precision they brought to fox hunting and seating charts. And Jennie was about to master every single one. Chapter 2. The affair that built a political machine. The Prince of Wales kept his mistresses the way other men kept horses, publicly, expensively, and with his wife's full knowledge. This was not a scandal. This was a system. In the highest circles of Victorian England, a rigid social code governed the conduct of extramarital affairs. The aristocracy called it discretion. What they meant was performance. As long as no one made a scene, as long as the correct forms were observed, as long as the wives smiled and the mistresses never sat in the wrong chair at dinner, the entire arrangement was tolerated, more than tolerated. It was expected. The Prince of Wales was the architect of this system. He kept a succession of mistresses throughout his marriage to Princess Alexandra of Denmark, and he did so with a casualness that would have destroyed a lesser man. Alexandra knew, society knew, the Queen knew, and the machine kept turning. The aristocracy even had a name for the arrangement. They called it the Rule of Three. A wife was expected to produce an heir, a spare, and then she was free to take a lover, provided she was discreet. The rule applied primarily to the highest social circles and was always more generous to men than to women. But it created a space in which certain women could operate with a freedom that legal wives in the drawing rooms below could never have imagined. What made Jennie Jerome different was that she understood the machine was not just social, it was political. Her affair with the prince gave her access to the most powerful drawing rooms in England, not the rooms where women arranged flowers and discussed menus, the rooms where policy was debated, where alliances were formed, where the future of the empire was shaped over brandy and cigars. Jennie sat in those rooms. She listened, she learned, and then she acted. Princess Alexandra received Jennie at Marlborough House, the prince's London residence. This was not merely polite, it was an official signal. To be received by the princess meant that the affair was sanctioned by the crown itself. Jennie was, in effect, given royal social protection. No hostess in London could refuse her after that. No door could close. And Jennie used that access to build something no other woman in Victorian England had ever attempted. She built a political machine. In 1883, Jennie and Lord Randolph founded the Primrose League in their home at Connaught Place. The League was ostensibly a conservative political organization dedicated to the principles of Benjamin Disraeli. In practice, it was one of the first vehicles for women's serious involvement in English politics. Jennie organized it with the precision of a military campaign. She recruited members by the hundreds. She delivered speeches to audiences that had never heard a woman speak on political matters. She canvassed door to door in constituencies where the residents had never seen a lady of her standing knock on a working man's door. She chaired public meetings with an energy and authority that stunned her contemporaries and unsettled her rivals. This was extraordinary. In 1883, women could not vote in parliamentary elections. They could not stand for office. They could not serve on juries. They could not enter the House of Commons except as spectators behind a grill. But Jennie Jerome, an American girl with a Brooklyn accent and a royal lover, was running a political operation that would help shape the direction of the Conservative Party for a generation. The Primrose League would eventually grow to over 1 million members. Jennie was there at its birth, in her own drawing room, making it happen. Lord Randolph rose fast. By 1886, he was Chancellor of the Exchequer and leader of the House of Commons, the two most powerful positions in government below the Prime Minister. His wife was credited, even by his opponents, as the engine behind his career. She wrote his correspondence, she managed his schedule, she cultivated his allies and neutralized his enemies with a social deftness that Randolph himself lacked. Some historians have called her his campaign manager, others have called her his strategist. The truth is simpler than either label. Jennie was the politician, Randolph was the name on the ballot, but Lord Randolph's rise contained the seed of his destruction. In December of 1886, he resigned as Chancellor in a dramatic gamble, betting that Lord Salisbury would refuse to accept. Salisbury accepted. Randolph's career was over at 37. He never held office again. And Jennie, who had built the machine that lifted him, was left standing in the wreckage. But not for long, because what happened next would require a different kind of power entirely. Chapter 3. The Sun She Built from the Shadows. When Lord Randolph Churchill died in 1895, broken and possibly syphilitic, Jennie did not retreat into mourning. Randolph died at 45. The cause of his death remains debated. Some historians favor syphilis, others point to a brain tumor. What is not debated is the condition of the man in his final years. He was erratic, confused, and physically deteriorating. His political career had ended nearly a decade earlier. His fortune was spent. His reputation was in ruins. Jennie was left a widow with 2 sons, minimal income, and a social position that depended entirely on relationships she had cultivated with her own hands. There was no inheritance to speak of. Randolph had spent freely and saved nothing. The £50,000 dowry that had opened the doors of the British aristocracy 21 years earlier was gone. A conventional widow would have retreated. Jennie accelerated. She transferred the full force of her political energy to her eldest son, Winston. He was 20 years old when his father died. Ambitious, impatient, brilliant in the way that young men who have never been tested are brilliant. He had a famous name and no money. He had powerful enemies who remembered his father's humiliation and saw no reason to help the son. What Winston needed was not advice. He needed a machine. And Jennie was the best machine builder in England. She gave him what money could not buy. She gave him access. She fundraised for his campaigns. She arranged press interviews with editors she had cultivated over 2 decades. She called in favors from every powerful man she had ever known, and she had known a great many. She wrote letters to generals who could advance his military career. She wrote letters to cabinet ministers who could open political doors. She wrote letters to newspaper proprietors who could shape public opinion. When Winston stood for Parliament at Oldham in September of 1900, Jennie was there, campaigning, organizing, pushing, working the crowds with a charm and a ferocity that her son would later make famous in his own right. Winston won, and he knew exactly who had put him there. He called her his most ardent ally. He said their relationship was more like brother and sister than mother and son. What he meant was that she was his equal, his partner, his strategist, the woman without whom his career might never have begun. While she was building Winston's career, Jennie was also living a private life of extraordinary romantic intensity. Her affair with Count Charles Kinsky, an Austrian diplomat who won the Grand National in 1883, was by most accounts the deepest love of her life. Kinsky was charming, athletic, and passionately devoted to her. Their affair lasted years, conducted with genuine feeling on both sides. When Kinsky married Princess Elizabeth von Thun und Hohenstein in 1895, Jennie was devastated. She did not stay devastated long. In 1900, she married George Cornwallis West, a man the same age as Winston. The marriage caused a social sensation. It also failed. They divorced in 1914. In 1918, she married again, this time Montague Porch, who was 3 years younger than her own son. Both marriages were driven at least partly by financial anxiety. Jennie's expenses always exceeded her income. She had the tastes of a duchess and the budget of a widow. Her literary magazine, the Anglo-Saxon Review, launched in 1899 with lavish production and ambitious editorial standards. Each issue was bound in ornate covers designed to look like antique books. The writing was excellent. The costs were ruinous. It folded after 10 issues in 1901. Her taste was exquisite. Her accounting was catastrophic. And yet, even in financial distress, Jennie never stopped working. During the Boer War, she organized a hospital ship to sail to South Africa, raising funds and marshaling support, with the same energy she had brought to the Primrose League 2 decades earlier. She was not a woman who sat still. She was not a woman who waited for rescue. She was a woman who acted constantly, relentlessly, on every front available to her. In June of 1921, Jennie fell while wearing new shoes. She broke her ankle. The fracture turned gangrenous. Her left leg was amputated above the knee. 2 weeks later, on June 29th, she suffered a hemorrhage and died. She was 67. Here is the paradox that the Gilded Age could never resolve. Jennie Jerome shaped British politics for 40 years. She built one career, salvaged another, and launched a third that would alter the course of the 20th century. She did all of this from outside every official structure. No title of her own, no vote, no office, no formal authority of any kind. The most politically influential woman in the British Empire held no position at all. Her power came entirely from relationships that the system called illegitimate. And that power was more real, more lasting, and more consequential than anything the system offered its wives. But Jennie Jerome was not the only woman who understood that the cage called marriage was not the only path to power. 3,000 miles away, another woman was proving the same truth through an entirely different strategy. A strategy built not on political connections, but on something far more audacious. She was going to marry the same fortune twice. Chapter 4. The Woman Who Came From Nowhere. Nobody knew where Arabella came from, and she spent her entire life making sure nobody ever would. The official record, such as it is, places her birth around 1850 in Richmond, Virginia. But even this basic fact is uncertain. One document lists her birthplace as Mobile, Alabama. Another says Union Springs, Alabama. The dates conflict by years. The names shift from document to document. Arabella Duval, Arabella Yarrington, Arabella Worsham. Each version of her name corresponds to a different version of her story, and none of them quite hold together. She gave conflicting birth dates on official papers with a casualness that suggests she did not care whether the record was accurate. She cared only that it was confusing. Confusion was her camouflage. What is known is that in 1869, a young woman arrived in New York City. She was perhaps 19, perhaps 20, perhaps older. She called herself Mrs. John Archer Worsham. She presented herself as the wife of a Richmond gambler named John Worsham. She was beautiful. She was composed. She carried herself with the quiet certainty of a woman who belonged wherever she stood. In a city full of women scrambling for position, Arabella never scrambled. She simply appeared, fully formed, and dared anyone to question the story she told. There was one problem. John Archer Worsham was already married. His wife's name was Annette. She was alive and well in Richmond. The marriage was a matter of public record. Arabella was not Mrs. Worsham. She had never been Mrs. Worsham. She had never married anyone. The entire identity was a fiction, constructed with care and maintained with discipline. In the Gilded Age, this kind of fiction was not unusual. Women reinvented themselves constantly, especially women who arrived in New York from the ruined South, with nothing but their looks and their nerve. The Civil War had destroyed the old order in Virginia. Families that had owned plantations were destitute. Women who had been raised in comfort were suddenly cast into a world where survival required invention. What was unusual was how completely Arabella committed to the invention. She did not just borrow a married name for convenience. She built an entire life on it. She attended social functions as Mrs. Worsham. She introduced herself as Mrs. Worsham. She inhabited the role with such conviction that questioning it would have felt rude. And then she built another life on top of that one. And then another. Around 1870, Arabella gave birth to a son. She named him Archer. The question of who fathered the boy would follow Arabella for the rest of her life and well beyond it. She never answered publicly. She never confirmed. She never denied. She simply refused to discuss it with a discipline that most politicians would envy. When asked directly, she changed the subject. When pressed, she left the room. The silence itself became a kind of power. The persistent rumor, whispered in drawing rooms and recorded by biographers decades later, was that the father was Collis P. Huntington, one of the richest men in America, one of the 4 men who built the Transcontinental Railroad, a man whose fortune was estimated at $70 million. If the rumor was true, then Arabella had been his mistress since at least 1869, while he was still married to his first wife, Elizabeth. To understand what this meant for Arabella, you have to understand what the law said about women in 1869. Under the doctrine of Coverture, which governed most of the English-speaking world throughout the 19th century, a married woman's legal existence was absorbed into her husband's upon marriage. She could not own property independently. She could not sign contracts. She could not sue or be sued in her own name. She could not keep her own earnings. Her dowry became her husband's property. Her inheritance was his to manage. Her identity, in the eyes of the law, simply ceased to exist. The Married Women's Property Acts had begun to chip away at this system. New York passed its first act in 1848. England followed in 1870 and again in 1882. But the reforms were slow, partial, and unevenly enforced. In practice, well into the 1890s, most wealthy wives remained financially dependent on their husband's goodwill or on trusts that male relatives controlled. A wife had protection. A wife had standing. A wife had a claim on her husband's estate, but a wife also had a cage. Her property was not her own. Her earnings were not her own. Her name was not her own. Arabella had none of that protection. She was not married. She had no legal claim on any man's fortune. She had no trust, no settlement, no safety net of any kind. She was a woman from nowhere, with a fictional married name, a son of uncertain paternity, and no rights that any court was bound to respect. And that absence of protection was the most valuable thing she possessed, because it meant she was free to earn her own money, free to keep it, free to invest it in her own name, free to walk away from any man at any time without a divorce proceeding, without a court battle, without a settlement negotiation that would strip her of everything she had built, free to be no one, which meant free to become anyone. The system designed to protect wives was also the system designed to contain them. It held them in place with the weight of law and the force of custom, and the constant reminder that without a husband, a woman was nothing. Arabella was outside that system entirely. She had nothing. No husband, no name, no standing, no claim on anyone or anything. And nothing, for a woman smart enough to use it, was the most dangerous kind of freedom there was. Because the system had no mechanism for controlling a woman, it could not categorize. It could constrain a wife. It could monitor a widow. It could scrutinize a divorcee. But a woman who was none of those things, a woman who existed in the space between all the categories, that woman was invisible to the system, and invisibility in the Gilded Age was power. The question was what she would do with it. The answer would take 30 years to fully reveal itself, and it would begin with a railroad. Chapter 5. Marrying the Same Fortune Twice. Collis P. Huntington built one of the most powerful railroads in American history, and Arabella made sure she was standing at the end of the line. Collis Huntington was one of the Big Four. Along with Leland Stanford, Mark Hopkins, and Charles Crocker, he built the Central Pacific Railroad, the western half of the first transcontinental line. In 1869, the year Arabella arrived in New York, the Central Pacific met the Union Pacific at Promontory Summit in Utah. It was one of the defining achievements of American industry. The four men who built it became some of the richest people on earth. Collis was the operator, Stanford was the politician, Hopkins was the accountant, Crocker was the builder. But Collis was the one who held the whole enterprise together through sheer force of will. He lobbied Congress. He negotiated contracts. He fought competitors in court, in the press, and occasionally in person. He was relentless, unsentimental, and ruthlessly effective. His fortune at its peak was estimated at $70 million. Arabella's relationship with Collis had been ongoing for years before it became public. If the rumors about Archer's paternity were true, they had been together since at least 1869, since the very year Arabella arrived in New York. That was also the year the Central Pacific was completed, the year the Golden Spike was driven at Promontory Summit, the year Collis Huntington became one of the most powerful men in America. The timing was not a coincidence. Arabella positioned herself near power with the same precision that Collis brought to building rail lines. But Collis was married. His first wife, Elizabeth, was alive, and divorce was socially catastrophic in the Gilded Age, even for a man of Collis's wealth. A divorce would have meant scandal. Scandal would have meant congressional scrutiny. Congressional scrutiny would have meant investigations into the financial arrangements that held the railroad empire together. Collis could afford a mistress. He could not afford a scandal. So Arabella waited. She maintained the fiction of being Mrs. Worsham. She raised Archer in comfort. She stayed close to Collis without ever forcing the issue, without ever making demands that would have forced him to choose between his reputation and his desire. She was patient the way a chess player is patient, every move calculated, every sacrifice intentional. And when Elizabeth Huntington died, Arabella moved. In 1884, Arabella married Collis P. Huntington. The wedding was quiet, The society pages barely noted it, but the implications were enormous. Arabella went from being a woman with no verifiable past, no legal marriage, and no social standing to being the wife of one of the 4 richest men in America. In a single ceremony, she acquired a name, a fortune, and a position that would have taken any other woman a lifetime to build. She had waited 15 years for that ceremony. She had never once wavered, and then Collis died. In August of 1900, Collis P. Huntington suffered a heart attack at Pine Knot, his camp in the Adirondacks, and died at the age of 78. Arabella inherited more than $50 million outright. Adjusted for inflation, that sum is equivalent to roughly $1.7 billion today. She was overnight one of the wealthiest women in the United States. She was also, for the first time in her life, truly independent. No fictional husband, no secret arrangement, no need to pretend, no need to wait. The fortune was hers, in her own name, under her own control. The $50 million alone would have secured her place in history. Most widows of the Gilded Age lived on the income from their inheritances, managed their households, entertained modestly, and gradually faded from public life. They became respectable shadows. Arabella did something else entirely. She married the fortune again. In 1913, Arabella married Henry Edwards Huntington. Henry was Collis's nephew. He had inherited a substantial portion of the Huntington Railroad interests and built an empire of his own in Southern California that rivaled anything his uncle had created. The Pacific Electric Railway, the famous red car system that connected the sprawling communities of Los Angeles County, was his creation. At its peak, the red car system operated over 1,000 miles of track and carried millions of passengers a year. Henry owned vast tracts of real estate across the region, buying land along his rail routes and watching its value multiply as the cars brought settlers and commerce. He had built a legendary estate in San Marino, California, with a library and art collection that was already becoming one of the most important in the country. When Arabella married Henry, she combined her inheritance from Collis with Henry's fortune and cultural ambitions. The result was a concentration of wealth, taste, and institutional power that few families in American history have matched. She had married the uncle's fortune in 1884. She married the nephew's fortune in 1913. The same bloodline, the same railroad money, the same name on the checks. It was the most audacious financial strategy of the Gilded Age, and no one seemed to know whether to be appalled or impressed. Consider the scale. Collis Huntington's estate at death was valued at more than $70 million in total assets, of which Arabella received over $50 million. Henry Huntington's personal fortune, built from railroads, real estate, and utilities, was estimated at tens of millions more. Together, Arabella and Henry controlled a combined empire worth well over $100 million at a time when the average American household income was around $750 a year. The art collection they would build together cost millions more, with individual paintings selling for prices that made international headlines. No legal wife of the Gilded Age, operating within the constraints of coverture and trust law, could have orchestrated what Arabella did. She moved from having nothing to controlling the cultural legacy of one of America's great fortunes. And she did it by marrying the same fortune twice. First the uncle, then the nephew. It was a strategy so audacious that most people, even at the time, could barely believe it. But Arabella had spent her entire life doing things that people could barely believe, and she was not finished yet, because the money was only the means. What she wanted was something that money alone could never buy. She wanted permanence. Emin Chapter 6. The Blue Boy and the Buried Past. In 1921, Arabella Huntington paid $728,800 for a single painting, and the art world understood who was really in charge. The painting was The Blue Boy by Thomas Gainsborough. It was one of the most famous works of art in the world, a full-length portrait of a boy in a shimmering blue satin suit, painted around 1770. For over a century, it had hung in the collection of the Duke of Westminster at Grosvenor House in London. It was considered a national treasure. The British public regarded it as part of the cultural inheritance of England itself. When the Duke decided to sell, the art world held its breath. And then it panicked. The dealer was Joseph Duveen. He was the most powerful art dealer of the early 20th century. a man who had made his fortune by selling European masterpieces to American millionaires. Duveen was brilliant, manipulative, and relentless. He controlled his clients through flattery, urgency, and social pressure. He told them what to buy, when to buy it, and how much to pay. He made their decisions for them and then congratulated them on their taste. His clients included the Rockefellers, the Fricks, and the Mellons. Most of them obeyed without question. Arabella was not most clients. She negotiated personally. She set her own terms. She examined the works with a connoisseur's eye that had been sharpened by decades of observation and study. She rejected anything that did not meet her standards, regardless of the provenance or the price. Duveen, who was accustomed to leading his buyers by the hand, found himself being led. He adapted. He learned to present works to Arabella differently than he presented them to his other clients. He gave her information, not instructions. He offered options, not directives. Because Arabella knew what she wanted, she knew what it was worth, and she knew that the final price would be her decision, not his. $728,800. It was the highest price ever paid for a single painting at that time. The purchase was international news. Newspapers on both sides of the Atlantic reported it. In England, there was genuine grief. The Blue Boy was leaving the country. It was going to America, to a woman whose name most English people had never heard, to hang in a gallery in California that most English people could not find on a map. The sale became a symbol of American wealth, American ambition, and the irreversible transfer of European cultural heritage to the New World. But for Arabella, the purchase was something more personal than national symbolism. It was proof. Proof that a woman who had arrived in New York in 1869 with a fictional married name and no verifiable past could, through intelligence, patience, and strategic brilliance, become the arbiter of one of the greatest art collections in American history. The Blue Boy was not the only masterpiece. Under Arabella's guidance, the collection grew to include works by Rembrandt, Vermeer, Velázquez, and Reynolds. Each acquisition was carefully chosen. Each negotiation was personally conducted. The collection that Arabella and Henry assembled would become the core holdings of the Huntington Library, Art Museum, and Botanical Gardens in San Marino, California. Today it is one of the most important cultural institutions in the United States. Consider what Arabella built. She started with nothing verifiable, no family name, no documented origin, no legal marriage, no trust fund, no social safety net. She acquired a fortune of over $50 million through her first marriage. She doubled it through her second. She transformed both fortunes into a permanent cultural institution that has educated and inspired millions of people for over a century. She did this in an era when married women could not own property in their own names, could not sign contracts independently, and could not keep their own earnings. Arabella could do all of those things. Because for most of her life, she was not a wife. She was something the system had no category for, something it could not contain, something it could not control. And when she was finished, she made one final decision, perhaps the most revealing decision of her entire life. Arabella ordered her personal papers destroyed. Upon her death on September 16, 1924, at her home in New York, her instructions were carried out with thoroughness that matched the woman who gave them. Letters were burned, documents were shredded, correspondence that might have revealed the nature of her relationship with Worsham, the truth about Archer's paternity, the details of her early years in Richmond, the private negotiations with Duveen, the conversations that no one else was meant to hear. All of it was destroyed. Diaries, if they existed, vanished. Photographs were sorted. The acceptable images survived. The rest did not. The truth about Arabella's origins, about the years before she became Mrs. Collis P. Huntington, was sealed permanently. Not by time, not by accident, by design, by her design. She traded her story for her legacy. The Huntington Library survives. The Blue Boy still hangs on its walls. 750,000 people walk through those galleries every year, past the Gainsborough and the Rembrandt and the Vermeer, and almost none of them know the name of the woman who put those paintings there. Arabella's personal history does not survive. She made certain of that. It was the final act of a woman who understood that in the Gilded Age, a woman's reputation was the only currency that could not be taken from her by law, by husband, or by court. Every other form of wealth could be seized under coverture. Every other form of power could be stripped by scandal. But a reputation, carefully constructed and fiercely guarded, belonged to its owner alone. Arabella protected hers the only way she knew how. She destroyed the evidence. She buried the past. And she left behind an institution instead of a story. But across the Atlantic, another woman was taking the opposite approach entirely. She was not burying her past. She was selling it. And she was about to prove that fame itself was a fortune waiting to be made. Chapter 7. The clergyman's daughter who stopped London. She wore a plain black dress to a party, and within a week, she was the most famous woman in England. Her name was Emily Charlotte Le Breton. The world would know her as Lily Langtry. She was born on October 13th, 1853, on the island of Jersey, a small British Crown dependency in the English Channel, 9 miles wide and 5 miles long. Her father was the Very Reverend William Corbet Le Breton, Dean of Jersey. Her mother was Emily Davis Martin. Lily was raised in a rectory, surrounded by 6 brothers, with an education that was better than most women of her era received and worse than she deserved. Her brothers were taught Latin and Greek. Lily was taught deportment and watercolors. The unfairness burned in her early, and it never stopped burning. Jersey was beautiful and small. The sea was everywhere. The social world was tiny, insular, and governed by the same families who had governed it for centuries. For a woman of Lily's intelligence, her restless energy, and her growing awareness that she was beautiful in a way that other people were not, the island was a prison with a view. She needed to leave. She needed to find a world large enough to hold the ambition that was building inside her. And in 1874, she found her way out. His name was Edward Langtry. He was the son of a Belfast shipping family. His income was approximately £3,000 a year, declining. He owned a yacht, he drank, he was pleasant enough company when sober, and increasingly unpleasant when not. He was, in almost every measurable way, unremarkable. He had no ambition, he had no talent, he had no particular interest in the world beyond the deck of his boat and the bottom of his glass. But Edward Langtry had one quality that mattered to Lily. He lived in London. He was a ticket off the island, nothing more, nothing less. They married in 1874. Lily was 20, Edward was 28. By the following year, they had arrived in London, settled into modest lodgings, and Lily's life changed forever. The story of that plain black dress has been told so many times that it has hardened into legend. But legends become legends because they are true. Lily attended a party hosted by Sir John and Lady Seabright. She could not afford a fashionable dress. She wore a simple black gown with no jewelry. In a room full of women in silk, satin, diamonds, and pearls, Lily stood out like a flame in darkness. Within days, every hostess in London wanted her at their table. Within weeks, she was the most talked about woman in England. Within months, she was what the Victorians called a professional beauty. The professional beauty phenomenon was one of the strangest products of Victorian culture. In the 1870s and 1880s, a handful of women became famous simply for being beautiful. Their photographs were reproduced on postcards and sold in shops across England. You could buy Lily Langtry's face for a penny. Men carried her photograph in their wallets. Women studied her image to copy her hair, her posture, her expression. Their movements were reported in newspapers as though they were heads of state. They were invited to parties not for their conversation or their connections, but for the simple fact that their presence attracted attention. They were the first celebrities in the modern sense, famous for being famous, famous for existing in a body that other people could not stop looking at. Lily became the most famous of them all, and it happened with a speed that astonished even Victorian London, a city accustomed to sensations. Sir John Everett Millais, one of the founders of the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood and one of the most celebrated painters in England, asked to paint her portrait. The result was a Jersey lily, exhibited at the Royal Academy in 1878. It made Lily a national sensation. The painting showed her holding a Guernsey lily, her face serene and impossibly lovely, her expression calm and self-possessed, in a way that suggested she knew exactly the effects she was having. Crowds gathered in front of it at the Academy, reproductions sold by the thousands. Her face was suddenly everywhere. Oscar Wilde arrived at her door with an armload of lilies. He was 23, unknown and desperate to be noticed. He was infatuated with Lily, though whether romantically or aesthetically was a question he probably could not have answered himself. He wrote poems to her. He accompanied her to parties. He appointed himself her unofficial publicist, telling anyone who would listen that Lily Langtry was the most beautiful woman in the world. For Wilde, Lily was art made flesh. For Lily, Wilde was useful. She kept him close, and she had done nothing. She had not acted, she had not sung, she had not written. She had not built or invested or campaigned. She was famous purely for existing, for having a face that stopped rooms, for wearing a black dress to a party at exactly the right moment. She was the most photographed woman in England before she had accomplished a single thing. But Lily Langtry was not a woman who was satisfied with being admired. Being admired was passive. Being admired meant other people held the power. They decided when to look and when to look away. Lily wanted something more active than admiration. She wanted control, and in 1877 she found it, in the most dangerous possible place, in the bed of the future King of England. Chapter 8. The Prince's Favorite and the Princess's Smile. Princess Alexandra did something that no wife in any drawing room in England would have dared. She invited her husband's mistress to dinner. The affair between Lily Langtry and the Prince of Wales began in 1877. She was 23, he was 35. He was the heir to the British throne, the most powerful social figure in England, and a man whose appetite for beautiful women was as well known as his appetite for 12-course dinners. He was also, it must be said, the same man who had taken Jennie Jerome as his mistress. The prince collected beautiful women the way his mother collected colonies, with enthusiasm, without apology, and with the full expectation that the world would accommodate his desires. The prince did not hide his affairs. He conducted them within the same rigid code that had protected his relationship with Jennie. The code had rules. A gentleman never acknowledged an affair publicly. A lady never caused a scene. A wife never confronted. A mistress never demanded. And everyone, at all times, behaved as though nothing was happening. The fiction of ignorance was maintained with the same care that the fiction of fidelity was abandoned. Within this code, the prince's relationship with Lily was conducted with remarkable openness. He visited her regularly at her home. He was seen with her at the theater, at the races, at dinner parties where her presence was noted by every guest and mentioned by none. He gave her gifts, including a house on Norfolk Street in Mayfair. He brought her to Marlborough House, his London residence, where she was received by Princess Alexandra herself. This was the most extraordinary detail of the entire arrangement. Alexandra was a Danish princess, beautiful, dignified, and devoted to her children. She had been humiliated by her husband's affairs for years. Every drawing room in London knew it, and yet, when Lily arrived at Marlborough House, Alexandra smiled. She was gracious. She was welcoming. She treated Lily as a guest, not a rival. Why? Because Alexandra understood the system better than anyone. She had watched her husband cycle through women for years. She had learned that anger accomplished nothing. A wife who confronted her husband's mistress was a wife who had lost control. A wife who wept was a wife who had lost dignity. A wife who received the mistress with grace was a wife who had absorbed the blow and kept her position intact. Alexandra chose grace. Her smile was not weakness. It was the most sophisticated form of power available to a woman trapped inside a royal marriage she could not escape. For Lily, the affair brought the highest level of social protection available in England. The prince's favor was a shield, and it was absolute. No hostess would cut a woman whom the prince openly favored. No scandal sheet would attack her too viciously. No door was closed to her. She was, for 3 years, untouchable. She moved through London society with the confidence of a woman who knew that the most powerful man in the country wanted her, and that everyone else had to pretend they did not notice. But the economics of being a royal mistress were less generous than the social benefits. The prince gave gifts. He gave access. He gave protection. He did not give cash. Lily's household expenses mounted while Edward Langtry's income declined. Her husband drank more heavily. His gambling debts grew. By the late 1870s, the Langtry household was in serious financial difficulty. Edward's income of £3,000 a year had eroded badly. The Norfolk Street house was a gift from the prince, but its maintenance cost money that Lily did not have. The dresses, the carriages, the appearances at parties and balls and race meetings all cost money, and the prince, for all his generosity in other matters, expected his mistresses to maintain themselves. By 1880, the affair was over. The prince moved on, as princes do, to the next beautiful woman who caught his eye. The relationship had lasted 3 years. It had given Lily social protection, public visibility, and a reputation that would follow her for the rest of her life. It had not given her money. It had not given her security. It had not given her anything that would survive the prince's attention. Lily was left with a social reputation, a bankrupt husband, and no income. Edward Langtry continued his descent into alcoholism. His gambling debts mounted. His health deteriorated. He would eventually be committed to the Chester County Asylum, where he died in 1897, alone and forgotten. Lily filed for divorce on grounds of his adultery that same year. The marriage that had been her ticket-off jersey had become a dead weight she could not afford to carry any longer. And then there was the daughter. In 1881, Lily gave birth to a girl named Jean Marie. The father was not Edward Langtry. The father was, by the strongest historical evidence, Prince Louis of Battenberg, a naval officer and a member of the extended European royal family. Prince Louis would later become the first Marquess of Milford Haven. His grandson was Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, husband of Queen Elizabeth II. Lily never publicly acknowledged Jean Marie's true paternity. The girl was raised first by Lily's parents and later by Lily herself. She was told that Edward Langtry was her father. The truth was buried, not unlike Arabella Huntington's past, though for different reasons. Arabella buried her origins to protect her reputation. Lily buried her daughter's origins to protect the crown. The affair was over. The husband was ruined. The daughter was a secret. And Lily Langtry, at 27, was famous, beautiful, socially connected, and completely broke. It was the worst moment of her life, and it was the moment that made her. Chapter 9. The first woman to sell herself on her own terms. Oscar Wilde told Lily Langtry to try the theater, and she turned his advice into a fortune that dwarfed every man she ever slept with. In 1881, with no money, a failing husband, and a newborn daughter whose paternity could never be revealed, Lily made a decision that shocked every drawing room in England. She went on the stage. No woman of her social standing had ever done this. The theater was considered barely respectable. Actresses were regarded with suspicion at best and contempt at worst. For a woman who had been received at Marlborough House, who had dined with the Princess of Wales, who had been painted by Millet and courted by Wilde, to stand on a stage and perform for paying audiences was a violation of every social norm of the era. Lily did not care. She had been broke. She had been abandoned by a prince and saddled with a drunk for a husband. She had a daughter whose very existence was a secret. Respectability had given her nothing. The stage paid. She debuted in London and then took her act to America, where the scandal of her reputation was, if anything, even more valuable than it was in England. Within a year, she was commanding fees that made her one of the highest-paid actresses in the English-speaking world. Her reviews were mixed. Critics noted that her acting was competent, but not brilliant. Some were unkind, others were generous. It did not matter what the critics said. Audiences did not come to see great acting. They came to see Lily Langtry. They came to see the woman who had been the Prince of Wales's lover. They came to see the face that had stopped London cold. They came because she was famous, and fame filled theaters in 1882 just as it fills stadiums today. Lily understood this. She may have been the first person in history who truly understood it. Lily formed her own theater company and toured Britain and America for over 25 years. She was her own producer, her own manager, her own brand. She chose the plays, she hired the actors, she managed the finances, she negotiated the contracts. In an era when married women could not sign contracts in their own names, Lily was running a business that spanned 2 continents. And then she did something even more audacious. In 1882, Pier Soap hired Lily Langtry to endorse their product. They paid her to lend her image to their advertisements, and in doing so, they created something that had never existed before: the celebrity product endorsement. Before Lily, no woman of social standing had sold her image for commercial gain. The idea was considered vulgar, But Lily understood, perhaps before anyone else in history, that fame was a commodity. It could be packaged, it could be sold, it could generate income that had nothing to do with talent, birth, or a husband's bank account. She was not merely selling soap, she was selling herself. And she did it without apology. The money from the stage and the endorsement was only the beginning. Lily did not spend her earnings the way most actresses spent theirs. She did not buy jewelry and wait for the next role. She invested, aggressively, strategically, with the eye of a woman who had been broke once and intended never to be broke again. She purchased vineyards in Lake County, California, establishing the Langtry Estate and vineyards. She bought ranches in the American West. She acquired and managed the Imperial Theatre in London, opening it in 1901 and running it until 1903. A town in Texas bore a version of her name, bestowed by Judge Roy Bean, a frontier justice who called himself the Law. West of the P. Chapter 10. What the wives lost and the mistresses kept. There is a question that the Gilded Age never answered, because the Gilded Age was afraid of the answer. The question is this. If marriage was designed to protect women, then why did the women who refused marriage accumulate more wealth, more influence, and more lasting power than almost any woman who accepted it? The answer begins with a legal doctrine called coverture. Under coverture, which governed most of the English-speaking world throughout the 19th century, a married woman's legal identity was absorbed into her husband's upon marriage. She did not merely lose her name, she lost her legal existence. She could not own property in her own right. She could not sign contracts. She could not sue or be sued. She could not retain her own earnings. If she worked, the money belonged to her husband. If she inherited, the inheritance became his to manage. If she brought a dowry, the dowry was his. The doctrine was ancient. Its roots reached back to the medieval common law of England, to a time when land was wealth and women were treated as property not far removed from the land itself. Its logic was patriarchal in the most literal sense. A married woman was not a person. She was an extension of her husband, his property, his responsibility, his to govern. The great legal commentator William Blackstone wrote that in marriage, the husband and wife became one person, and that person was the husband. He wrote this as though it were natural law, as fixed and inevitable as gravity. It was not natural, it was constructed, and it was constructed to serve the interests of men. The reforms came slowly. New York passed the first Married Women's Property Act in 1848. England followed in 1870 and again in 1882. These acts allowed married women to own property and keep their earnings. They were genuine progress. But the reforms were incomplete. Enforcement was uneven. Judges were reluctant. Husbands were resistant. Social custom lagged decades behind the law. In practice, well into the 1890s, most wealthy wives remained financially dependent on their husbands or on trusts controlled by male relatives who made the decisions and doled out the allowances. Now consider the mistress. She had no legal claim on any man's fortune. She had no social guarantee. She had no safety net. If the affair ended, she had nothing. If the man died, she inherited nothing, unless he had made private arrangements that his legitimate family could challenge. She was exposed, vulnerable, and entirely dependent on her own resources. But she was also free, genuinely free. She could earn money and keep it in her own name. She could invest without a husband's permission. She could sign contracts without a trustee's approval. She could own property without a male relative controlling the title. She could walk away from a relationship without a divorce proceeding, without lawyers, without a court deciding how to divide assets that were never legally hers. She could, in short, live as a full legal person. The very thing that marriage denied to wives. The system called this absence of protection a vulnerability. The system was wrong. For women who were intelligent enough, strategic enough, and ruthless enough to exploit it, the absence of protection was the most valuable freedom available to any woman in the 19th century. Jennie Jerome used that freedom to build a political network that shaped the British Empire. Arabella Huntington used it to control the cultural legacy of one of America's great fortunes. Lily Langtry used it to build a business empire that rivaled those of the men she knew most intimately. The wives who obeyed every rule, who signed the contracts, who accepted the protection, lost everything when their husbands failed. The mistresses who broke every rule built legacies that survive to this day, and the system that was supposed to explain this contradiction could not. Chapter 11. What survived and what was erased. Jennie Jerome shaped the 20th century from outside every official structure, and there is no statue of her anywhere. Think about what she did. She co-founded the Primrose League, one of the first political organizations to give women a meaningful role in English politics. She managed her husband's career with a strategic brilliance that his colleagues openly acknowledged. When that career collapsed, she did not collapse with it. She launched her son Winston into the political career that would, in time, help save Western civilization from fascism. She founded a literary magazine that published some of the finest writers in the English language. She organized a hospital ship during the Boer War, raising the funds and the supplies and the volunteers through sheer force of will. She maintained a network of political and social relationships that spanned the British Empire for 4 decades. She did all of this as a woman, with no vote, no title of her own, no official standing of any kind. There is no statue. There is no plaque on the British Embassy in Paris, where she married Randolph in 1874. The International Churchill Society maintains archives on her political career, but they are filed under her son's name, not her own. Her homes in London still stand, unmarked, but she is remembered primarily as Winston Churchill's mother. The woman who shaped the man who shaped the century is reduced to a footnote in her son's biography, a line in someone else's story. Her power was real. Its monuments are invisible. Arabella Huntington's legacy is both more visible and more anonymous. The Huntington Library, Art Museum, and Botanical Gardens in San Marino, California, is visited by more than 750,000 people every year. The Blue Boy hangs there still, in the same gallery where Arabella intended it to be displayed. The collection she helped assemble is one of the finest in the Western Hemisphere. Both Arabella and Henry are buried on the grounds of the estate they shared. The institution is Arabella's monument, but relatively few visitors know her name. Even fewer know her story. The woman who arrived in New York with a fictional married name and no verifiable past, who married the same fortune twice, who negotiated with the most powerful art dealer in the world on her own terms, has been largely erased from the story of the institution she helped create. She would likely prefer it that way. Anonymity was always her most effective weapon. Lily Langtry left the most visible public legacy of the 3. The Langtry Estate and Vineyard still operates in Lake County, California. The Lily Langtry Stakes is still run at the Curragh Racecourse in Ireland. The town of Langtry, Texas, still bears the name that Judge Roy Bean gave it in her honor. She is remembered as a beauty, an actress, and a royal mistress, but her most important achievement is the least well known. She was a self-made businesswoman in an era when the phrase itself was a contradiction. Women did not make themselves. Women were made by their fathers, their husbands, and the institutions that govern them. Lily rejected every one of those makers and built herself from scratch. That achievement deserves more than a horse race and a wine label. The pattern is clear and it is damning. The women who exercised the most genuine power in the Gilded Age left the fewest monuments. Their influence was personal, not institutional. It flowed through relationships, not bureaucracies. It depended on presence, not titles. And when they died, the influence died with them. The institutions they helped build survived. The stories of how they built them did not. This is not an accident. This is not an oversight. This is the system working exactly as it was designed. A system that could not acknowledge the power of women who operated outside its rules could certainly not memorialize them after they were gone. To memorialize them would be to admit that the rules were wrong. To admit that the rules were wrong would be to question the entire architecture of marriage, property, and power that the Gilded Age built its fortunes upon. The silence about these women is not neglect. It is strategy. But the question remains, and it is a question that demands an answer. Chapter 12. The lie that was called protection. The Gilded Age told women that marriage would protect them, and the women who believed it lost everything. They lost their names. Under coverture, a wife's legal identity was absorbed into her husband's. She ceased to exist as an independent person in the eyes of the law. They lost their money, a wife's dowry, her inheritance, her earnings, all became her husband's property. The reforms came. but they came slowly, and they came incomplete, and for millions of women, they came too late. They lost their autonomy. A wife could not sign a contract, could not own property in her own right, could not choose where to live, how to spend, or whom to see without her husband's permission. The cage was built from statutes and precedent and centuries of custom, and it was gilded so thoroughly that most women could not see the bars. The system called this protection. The church called it sacred. The law called it coverture. And generations of women accepted the bargain because they were told it was the only bargain available. But it was not the only bargain. There was another path. It had no name. It had no legal standing. It offered no guarantees and no safety net. It was dangerous and uncertain and entirely without the protections that society promised its wives. And it was the path to genuine power. Jennie Jerome took that path. She conducted affairs with kings and counts and diplomats, and she converted those affairs into a political network that shaped the British Empire for 40 years. She raised a son who would become one of the most consequential leaders of the 20th century. She did this without holding a single official title, without casting a single vote, without signing a single document of state. Her power was invisible. Her influence was immeasurable. Arabella Huntington took that path. She arrived in New York with nothing and left behind one of the most important cultural institutions in America. She married the same fortune twice. She negotiated with the most powerful art dealer in the world and won. She built a legacy that 750,000 people visit every year, and then she burned the evidence of how she built it because she understood that the truth about her past was the one thing that could destroy what she had created. Lily Langtry took that path. She turned beauty into fame, fame into fortune, and fortune into an empire that spanned 2 continents. She was the first woman to sell her image for profit. She owned property, signed contracts, raced horses, managed theaters, and ran vineyards in an era when married women could do none of those things. She built everything herself, from nothing, answering to no one. Every woman who signed the marriage contract trusted a system that was designed to serve someone else. Every woman who accepted the ring accepted the cage that came with it. Every woman who believed that protection was protection and not control disguised as devotion paid the price in silence, independence, and in the quiet erosion of everything that made her a person in her own right. The 3 women in this documentary refused that bargain. They were not saints. They were not victims. They were strategists operating in a world that gave them no legitimate path to power and penalized them for every illegitimate path they took. They used beauty, intelligence, relationships, and a willingness to live outside the rules to build lives that the rules were specifically designed to prevent. The Gilded Age is over. Coverture is gone. The Married Women's Property Acts finished their work. Women can own property, sign contracts, vote, hold office, and keep their own earnings. The legal cage has been dismantled piece by piece, statute by statute, over more than a century of reform. But the question these women ask still matters. It matters because the instinct behind coverture did not die when the law changed. The instinct to protect women by controlling them, the instinct to offer safety in exchange for autonomy, the instinct to build a cage and call it shelter. That instinct outlived every statute that encoded it. If the system that promised to protect you was really a system designed to control you, then who was the system designed to serve? If the women with no legal claim were the ones who accumulated the most genuine power, then what does that tell you about the relationship between protection and freedom? If 3 women with no ring, no contract, and no safety net built legacies that outlasted every protected wife of their generation, then what exactly was the protection for? The Gilded Age answered that question clearly, even though it never meant to. The women with no ring, no legal claim, and no protection at all were the ones who were truly free. And the system that called itself protection was nothing but a lie wrapped in gold and sealed with a vow.